Comrade Rousseau, yes. Huh? Yeah, Rousseau, no? Yeah, come.
Afternoon all. Let us pray. Almighty God, Father in heaven, as we come to you, Lord, this day, we thank you, Lord, for a beautiful day, a beautiful afternoon, Lord. And as we gather as comrades, Lord, to this auspicious hall, Lord, this day, Lord, we ask that you guide us, protect us. Help us, Lord, to enjoy the proceedings this evening, Lord, to learn from it, to interact and ask questions. Lord, we ask that you bless those on the way, Lord, guide them and bring them here safely, Lord. In Christ's precious name we pray. Amen.
In Russia raised many aspirations, and I wish I was living in that period. It seemed as if the strikes and riots of the 1930s were being taken as a warning from the West Indies. An Englishman wrote a book called Warning from the West Indies about the situation in the 30s. Change was in the air. People like Butler were the John the Baptists of social and political change. So that was my kind of potted background of the 1930s. And I said I would be talking about Butler in literature. But before I go there, I should say something about Butler and the riots in calypsos. Many calypsos were sung about social and political issues in the 1930s. Now, an act had been passed in 1920, the Sedition Act, which referred mainly at that time to books and pamphlets and magazines. But from 1920 right on to 1937, the Sedition Act began to take on other things. I mean, the enemies of thought, the enemies of free speech, the board of censors moved to newspapers. So newspapers could be guilty of sedition. They moved to speeches in public. That could be sedition. They moved to the movies. That could be sedition. So the calypsos had to, by 1937, all calypsos, before you could sing them or play them or make recording of them, had to go to the censors for them to decide whether they would allow it. So by 1937, censorship of calypsos was in full force. Many of the calypsos about 1937 and the years afterwards suffered censorship. They were not played or sung at the time. Calypsos like Butler the Leader, Riot in Trinidad by Lion. And the authorities deliberately did not allow any calypso that saw Butler as a hero. So when you go and look at those calypsos, you see Nankivel, you see Murchison Fletcher, you see everybody, but very few calypsos, whole calypsos about Butler. Because there's a deliberate plan not to let the public hear anything that would make them think of Butler as a hero. A very important calypso, the strike in Trinidad by radio, that was banned. The alternative name for that calypso was Murder in Faizabad. The murder of Charlie King and the murder of workers. I think that all our education would benefit from knowing about the calypsos in the 1930s. There wasn't any great profundity in them, but they marshal the facts and they tell you what were the feelings and what is the mood of the country. And I quote, I think there's a very good chapter about this in Gordon Rolaire's book, Calypso and society in pre-independence Trinidad. It's less than 100 pages. Go in a library somewhere and read his chapter on the calypsos and the 1930s. I'm just going to quote from Rolaire's book a sample which he provides from a calypso by beginner. On the night of the 18th, I received a shock. I believe the hour was 12 o'clock. I saw faces sad, I saw faces glad. And the thing had her so confused, and she told me, let me go and see. I said, carry yourself, but don't carry me. The fever was so strong, I must explain how it reached down to Port of Spain. Children and teachers had to leave their school, running faster than any mule. All business places had to close down when they said, the fever in town. And the amount of incidents I saw everywhere, I thought resurrection morning was near. The calypsos are interesting, and they show how smart and careful the singers were. They made sure that they couldn't be picked up and charged with sedition because of the sedition law. So they find all kind of, Chalky sang, Afraid Carl. I want to say so, but Afraid Carl. The same device that Chalky used for saying, I would have liked to say so and so, but I know I shouldn't say it. So he's saying it even though he's saying he's not going to say it. Those calypsonians of the 30s found ways of getting around the sedition law, saying what they wanted to say, but pretending they weren't really saying it. They did a lot of masking. So, right, I now want to go to some poems by a poet from Tobago called Eric Roach. He was born in 1915 and he died in 1974. And I'm sorry to say he was so depressed about his own life and the state of society and the state of literature and the state of politics that he drowned himself at Queen Anne Bay. He just walked straight in the sea and drowned. That was his suicide. Now the first extract from Eric Roach comes from a poem called Hard Drought. We marched in Butler's barefoot mad battalions in a damned time on the slave world's slipping edge. Our arms were rhetoric, and they shot us down and scattered us to the trade winds. We shook the pillars of the place and wept. The people rose in mad battalions. They were barefoot. They were unarmed. All they had as weapons was anger and rhetoric and the will to stand up for their human rights. And they were blown away. In the second extract, Roach makes us feel the fiery gospeler who preached the dignity of labor and the possibility of creating a just society if only the working people, oil and sugar, African and Indian, could move with one voice and one heart. The poet sets up a contrast in the poem between the imposing figure at the center of the island-wide movement of the people that began in 1937. On the one hand, that fellow, and he contrasts him with the sad relic that Butler had become after 1950. You could say Butler won the elections to the Legislative Council in 1950. But they cheated him. They did not ask him to be a minister. They did not ask him to head the local members of the They didn't ask him to form the government. Instead, they called upon Bertie Gomes and Norman Tang and Judah Singh, and these were so. The system really went after Butler, and they destroyed him. So post-1950, Butler was reduced to being a buffoon. And children have now grown up who know nothing about Butler, nothing about the period, nothing about this John the Baptist who was crying for trade unionism, worker solidarity, and home rule in the 1930s. And I hope that symposiums like this will help to bring Butler back into the consciousness of people. So this poem when I met him face to face, he had become a poor buffoon, a decrepit, toothless hound, whining at his private fleas. Yet, proud and raging in his prime, his anger set a blazing torch to centuries rotten with our shames and singed the old slave tapestry. Now, the heroic man grown old eats the pap of the mad King Lear. I've heard him rant and seen him mocked because history's ceaseless flood has left him on a muddy shoal, sometimes baying in the wind, sometimes howling, a mad dog at the current in its course. The final extract picks up on the image of Butler, proud and raging in his prime, and lighting fires in oil and canes. Once, Buster worked a Kingston mob combustible, and Butler, shouldering Cipriani out, lit fires in oil and canes to give their sad slave labor today's meanings. Moved men make miracles. The rest churn lies, and history fells them like dead forest trees and rots their sodden memories like leaves. Those who make miracles are going to live on. The rest, who tells lies and play politics, they're going to fall like dead trees and rot. So Roach was aware of Butler's achievements. He was aware of Butler being now treated as a buffoon. And in these poems, he seeks to restore some kind of balance. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to say much about Michael Anthony's novel, Butler Till the Final Bell. This is a novel that goes almost day by day through a couple of weeks in June 1937, giving you all the movements, all the speeches, the way in which the authorities were behaving and thinking and so on. And at one point, one of Butler's supporters tells him, "You went on Siberia and said something about the king. I hope you know that whenever you mention the king, they're going to charge your tail for sedition, so you better watch your mouth. Do not mention the king." And Butler, the king is flesh and blood, just like you and me. He born just like us, and he'll die just like us. But my God will never die. Some place in the Bible say, kings and queens and princes go forth in golden raiments. But I ain't fighting for riches, and I ain't fighting for splendor. I fighting for better times for the workers. You'll be surprised what Apex could afford to give to the workers. But Hickling will never do it. He'll never bend. So we'll have to break him. That's from Michael Anthony's novel. And the third book I want to refer to is a wonderful novel called Crown Jewel. It is, I think about it as the book of Trinidad. It is the most complete representation in all literature of the state of society, culture, and politics in Trinidad in the 1930s. Now, Biswas was a white boy. His grandmother was a slave. So the Biswas family, as it was split into the white Biswas and the colored Biswas whom they scorned. But RAC Biswas, on the colored side, grew up among them, but gradually began to distance himself from them because his friends were C.L.R. James, Alfred Mendez, Bertie Percival, Clement Payne, and he was introduced to Butler. He was also a friend of Albert Gomes. So Mendez began to associate with other Trinidadians who were of the same mind as he. And he got indoctrinated into socialism. He was a rabid socialist. Well, of course, his family didn't like that, and he was a kind of outcast. Capitalists didn't like that, so he lost his job. And by about 1948, he decided he can't make it in Trinidad. He's not going to make it as a writer. Nobody going to publish him. He can't get a good work. He has a wife and 2 children. So he went away to Chicago, and after 6 months, he finally went down to Australia. And it was in now, before he left Trinidad, he had finished Crown Jewel. And he sent it to American publishers. He sent it to British publishers. But they said, no, we don't want that. He went to Australia and he continued working on it. And at last, in 1952, the book came out. It came out in Germany. We never hear about it. There I am, the big bourgeois writing about the West Indian novel and its background. It's only when I nearly finished it, I come across Crown Jewel. If Crown Jewel had appeared in Trinidad in the late 40s and early 50s, this would have been a different society. And I could tell you, if Crown Jewel was read by every school child in Trinidad today, everybody in the upper forms in secondary school, Trinidad would become a better place to live in. Because that book has all the races, all the classes, all the colors, and it was written with great sympathy about the fusion society that was coming into being in the 1930s. Nobody writing from the West Indies has captured the diversity, the peculiar ways of moving, the tensions, and the overlapping of tribes in Trinidad as this book does. Nobody has written so beautifully about the city of Port of Spain or the physical landscape of Trinidad. Nobody has described the battle of flesh and spirit in the way that Biswas has done it. And nobody has written so intricately about the feelings and about the torture and exhilaration of young love as he has. Because the central character, Andre Coudray, has many of the experiences of Biswas himself. So I'm telling you that this is a wonderful Trinidad novel, and it is at the heart of this novel, you have the Butler riots of 1937. And one of the main characters in it is a gentleman called Lamech. And Lamech is partly based upon Butler. He is not totally Butler. This is a work of fiction, and he's inventing a leader. But the main ingredients in Lamech come from Butler. And the things that happened to Butler in real life are the things that happened to Lamech. But Biswas is a very serious writer, and he wasn't just writing a simple book about 1937 and Butler. He was writing about our world, our whole world, the whole of Trinidad. And to me, that gives what he has to say about Butler and the riots added force and meaning. So, having made my little spiel about Crown Jewel, do you think you can't get to buy? Or the one you're getting to buy is rubbish. What happened was that in the 1980s, some people tell Biswas, incidentally, he was a good man. He lived to the age of 101. Somebody told Biswas, we want to republish your novel. Just touch it up and we'll do it. He just touch it up. He F it up. He was in his 90s. And he revising a book that he wrote when he was about 30-something. It's the same thing that the great William Wordsworth did. He wrote a long poem called The Prelude. Then he turned around and write it over, and he spoiled it. So we still need, but okay, the one I say is rubbish is still very good to read. But as a scholar and a critic, I know. When I wrote him and I told him, I said, Ralph, you did shit with this revised edition of Crown Jewel. Do you know that Crown Jewel is this and that? When I told him all the things that Crown Jewel was about, his wife wrote me back and said, you made Ralph cry. Because he knew he'd done stupidness. But it is a long book. And there could have been publishers' pressures to shorten it. But we still have the original Panther edition, which is thing. And I hope one day I'll persuade somebody to put up some money to republish the original edition. Well, I'm going to close with a speech in the novel from the trial of Lamech. In this speech, Biswas is drawing upon the speech that Butler himself made in his own trial. So Biswas pulled that speech and used it and gave it to Lamech. And I have to tell you, I pulled this speech and I touch it up a little bit for the purposes of reading it here. I prepared this for an actor to read for me. So you really need an actor to do it. So you're not going to get an actor's reading, But I'm going to try and do my best. I know what I accused and what I wanted out of the reading from the actor. Gentlemen of the jury, I am accused of stirring up ill feeling in workers against their employers. The police say they copied down the following words from one of my speeches in Siparia. These are the words. There is only one weapon in the hands of the workers: strike action. It is the mission of the workers to destroy the stranglehold the capitalists have on our lives. It is our mission to take profits away from them and distribute them among the workers in the industry. What's so sinful about saying that? I don't deny using the words that the police say I use. I use them. Yes, I use them. It's not my words that create discontent. Any fool could see my words were only trying to make all you recognize the discontent that was, is, and has always existed amongst the workers from slavery to now. It have anyone among you who will dare to tell me that workers are satisfied? The enslaved people were satisfied? I, a worker, stand in this court accused of stirring up ill feeling and discontent. Oh, so who is it that say one pair of bloomers per year was enough for a working woman? Me? I say that? Me? Or the minimum wage committee? It's them who say it. Look at this report, gentlemen. It says in black and white that a man can live on 69 cents a day. Anybody know how much 69 cents in those days would be worth now? 69 cents. No economist here? The Minister of Agriculture said Professor Samaru don't like economists. He don't put them on his committees. All your big scholars do it. But 69 cents a day was plenty. But I said plenty for a worker. Although the fellows who were getting 90 cents a day were living in filth and degradation. It was rough. And the Minimum Wages Committee, knowing that some people were getting 90, said, look, you can give them up to 69. And a woman only needs one panty a year. Because as you know, some of them black people do wear none. She might only wear it for going out. Prisoner at the bar, I strongly advise you not to raise your voice in this court. I would not like to have to commit you for contempt of court. Noted, Your Honor. If I have been disrespectful to the court, I apologize, Your Honor. Gentlemen, I tell you what the Minimum Wages Committee say about 69 cents a day. Who really is stirring up ill feeling in this place? Who it is? Eh? Who it is? I must ask you to bear in mind that you are not now at a street corner, but in a court of law, defending yourself against a very serious charge. Noted, Your Honor. Gentlemen of the jury, you are all aware that violence only started when the police beat us off the Faizabad fields. Was that the way to improve the relations between the bosses and the workers? They were determined to suppress with force what they could have avoided by negotiation. and by a willingness to take less and give more. You hear that? Take less and give more. Is the governor and the legislative council self who give this advice to the employers? Hey, Your Honor, you and I know he go pay a big price for talking like that. But I'm so glad Mr. Fletcher ring the bell for justice. Hearken again. The ones who are truly guilty of sedition are not here in this court. It's they who rouse the workers to fury by their heartless and harsh treatment of workers. It's the papers who call on the police to take punitive action against workers. It's the police and the local troops and the gunmen from the Ajax and the Exeter who join up to mash us up like how Mussolini mashed up the people of Abyssinia. Them is the ones who should be here on trial, not Benjamin Lamech. Them is the ones. It have foreigners who spend $60 a month on their dogs, more than twice the amount that thousands of workers make in 1 month. Where is justice when the law permits that? Permits newspapers to incite others against us because we demand to be treated as human, wanting to jail us because we refuse to live worse than dogs. Whose law is this? Who make this law? It's not our law. It's a law they make to exploit our land and to oppress us in Babylon. I must warn you, the judge interrupted, that you cannot shout here as if you are in a Baptist church. I cannot allow political speech making in my court. All right, Your Honor. Noted, Your Honor. Gentlemen, I have seen men and their wives and children literally starving. Yes, we heard that before. But what defense are you putting up to the charge against you? Advice noted, sir. Thanks for worrying about me, sir. I say straight out, I am not guilty. My words express the anger and frustration of people who were brutalized by the guilty ones I just tell you about. Gentlemen of the jury, I am black, and I may not be so comely, but I'm not stupid on top of that. You think I'm so stupid to instigate unarmed workers, to attack people with rifle and bayonet and machine gun for them to get shoot down black as white? My wish is for workers to get a greater share of the wealth they make for the oil companies. My whole life is dedicated to that one purpose. Whoever stand in my way, do so at their peril. If that is what you want me to plead guilty of, yes. If that is incite, yes. Yes, I incite. You want to pronounce me guilty for doing what every trade union in the world has the right to do? The prosecutors say that there must be peace in industry if we're to have progress. You know why he wants peace in industry? He wants peace in industry for the workers to continue to suffer hunger, degradation, and death. I done, Your Honor.
Yeah, I think it's a real pity that the secondary school children were not here to listen to these excerpts from the literature. I just want to make one addition. The governor, Murchison Fletcher. Murchison Fletcher was caught between his duty to the English crown and his admiration for Butler. That's the governor. And he said, a lot of us are romantics, and Uriah Butler is a romantic. And we can't blame him for the way he speaks. And he really represents the suffering of the masses of Trinidad and Tobago. Well, who tell the governor to say that? Who tell the governor to write that to England? The Secretary of State told him, because of that, because you are siding with this black man, you are against the British capitalists in the country, so I want you to resign. And I have organized with some doctors here to say you are sick, and because of illness. And Murchison Fletcher wrote back, he said, I'm only 59, I'm in the pink of health. I'm running around Queen's Park, Savannah every morning. So I'm really not sick, and I'm not going to accept your declaration of me as sick, so I'm going to resign. And the Secretary of State said, if you decide that you are not going to resign because you are sick, and I'm going to get you a certificate saying you're sick, if you're not going to do that, I am really not sure that whenever you resign, you'll get your pension. That was a threat that the Secretary of State held over Murchison Fletcher for the governor being sympathetic to Butler. So he said, if you're not sick, because I'm telling you you're sick, that one in England, this one here, but the one in England who is not a medical person, telling the governor you're sick. And I have already instructed a doctor to say you're sick. And if you tell me you are not sick, let me tell you something. I'm not so sure that when you retire, whether you'll become a pauper or not. And poor Murchison Fletcher, at 59, was forced to retire and spend the rest of his days in England. He wouldn't get a job because they said he was a man dismissed by the colonial authorities. So that tells you of the strength of Butler and of the punishment that anybody got who supported Butler. So I want to ask David to make a few comments now.
Thank you very much, Brinsley. Colleagues on the panel, comrades all, good evening. First, let me apologize for getting here late. It was one of those days when I had several media commitments in Port of Spain. So after my radio program, I was asked this morning by Fazia Mohammed to speak with a journalist who was writing about the rebel cricket tours to South Africa. And of course, we protested. Lyle Townsend and myself and others organized a demonstration outside the Oval on the 4th of March, 1986, against the British cricketers, MCC cricketers who had gone to South Africa, Gooch, Embry, and others. And there was serious repression. People were beaten, arrested, and so on. So I did that and then did a short interview program with TV6, which is supposed to come over, I think, on 7:30 on Sunday night together with Ralph Henry. And I'd done a separate interview with Gregory Aboud, who's talked about the foolish holidays and so on. But anyways, so I got out of Port of Spain about 3:30, so my apologies for getting here late. Let me just pick up on what Professor Samru spoke about with respect to the governor, Murchison Fletcher, and his sympathy with respect to the workers' protest, the general strike of June 19th, 1937. When I first read the first minutes of the Oilfields Workers' Trade Union, written by Comrade E.R. Blades, I'm getting tongue-tied right now. The minutes said, and his photograph is up there on the wall, when he was young, the minutes made reference to someone speaking at that first meeting of the union, which was on the 15th of July, 1937, Mr. Williams' quarters, Coonstown Forest Reserve. And someone in the meeting said that, as advised by the governor, Sir Murchison Fletcher, and they were referring to people, comrades who were in the meeting on the 15th of July, who had attended or were part of the workers' delegation that met the governor. I couldn't understand it. I didn't know all of the details. So speaking with Comrade Blades many years afterwards, he said to me that Murchison Fletcher came down to Forest Reserve on the 15th of July, I think it was, and the workers met with him for a very long time and gave him in great detail the various grievances which would have given rise to the strike. Of course, he would have been aware previous to that because Butler and others had been agitating and speaking and writing about these matters. But the workers of Forest Reserve had a direct one-on-one meeting with the governor. And his response to them was that, my advice to you is to organize a trade union. And it was that very night on the 15th of July, 1937, that the workers of Forest Reserve held the first meeting of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union. And recorded in the minutes of that first meeting were people like John F.F. Rojas, McDonald Moses, and a number of others, Mr. Peters, and some others whose names not coming to me off the top of my head. And they were the ones who then organized the first conference of delegates of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union, which was held in Saltfish Hall, Mucurapo Street in San Fernando. And it was at that first delegates conference that Adrian Kohler Rienzi was elected as the President General of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union. But at the first meeting on the 15th of July, there was elected by the Forest Reserve workers an interim president of the union. Blades was interim secretary, and there were other interim officers and so on. The union name was established, not registered, but they named the union, and they set the union dues. There was a long discussion in the minutes about how much the dues should be, and so on and so on. And they agreed on an entrance fee and a weekly dues, and so on. And it was that core of workers that then went around to the other oil fields and held meetings and so on. And they had very little financial help or assistance. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Muriel McDonough Davidson's father, who was self-employed and so on, who gave them a little bit of money to help print the pamphlets and that kind of thing. So, and what Comrade Blade said to me is that there was a debate, and we do have the record of the first conference of delegates of the union in Comrade Blade's own handwriting and so on. And what he had said to me was that at that meeting, that conference of delegates, there was a beginning of a division, because the comrade who had been elected interim president on the 15th of July by the Forest Reserve workers thought that he automatically should be the first President General. And the comrades of Pointe-à-Pierre, employed by Trinidad Leaseholds Limited, because Pointe-à-Pierre was a much larger workplace, much more workers. The Pointe-à-Pierre workers felt that a representative of Pointe-à-Pierre should be the first president. And it was in that context that a suggestion was made to have Comrade Rienzi be the first President General of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union. That was what Comrade Blades had recounted to me. And I know that I had recorded that interview with him, and also it is somewhere in your office to be found, because I know that I found it in the General Secretary's office sometime before I left, and I handed it over to you. I'm absolutely certain of that. And so you have to find that, because it's a very important record. But the record of the first conference of delegates, because Comrade Blades was very meticulous in recording the details of all of the meetings that they had in the first days and weeks after the 15th of July, 1937. So I just thought I would mention that in relation to the role of Murchison Fletcher in seeding the idea, if you wish, that the workers should form the trade union in the almost, well, not the heat, because the heat already died down, but in the immediate heat of the 1937 strike. Because Professor Samu is correct when he spoke earlier about the fact that the 1932 Trade Union Ordinance did not result in the Trinidad Workingmen's Association being registered as a trade union and changed its name to the Trinidad Labour Party and so on. So I don't want to speak at length, because we have another distinguished speaker. Professor Ramchan was excellent in terms of how the literature of the day, both in terms of calypso and novels and so on, addressed and treated with the events of 1937 and that particular context. I just want to refer to one or two statements written about that period. One was written in 1939 by Arthur Lewis, later to become famous as Sir Arthur Lewis, Nobel prize-winning economics from St. Lucia, and the first vice-chancellor of the University of the West Indies. I think I'm correct in saying that. And Arthur Lewis was in London at the time and wrote a pamphlet for the Fabian Society, which is one of the soft socialist organizations that existed in the UK at the time, the Fabian Society. So he wrote this pamphlet called Labour in the West Indies, The Birth of a Workers' Movement by W. Arthur Lewis. And it was sold for £1. And this was written in 1939. So he wrote about Jamaica, Barbados, St. Kitts, Guyana, British Guyana at the time, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Trinidad. All of the workers' revolts, anti-colonial revolts and strikes that took place between the period about 34, 35 and 1938, and did some analysis of what was taking place. I just want to quote from what he wrote in 1939 because it's important. He said this on page 40. This was republished by New Beacon Books in the early 70s with an afterword by Susan Craig. It was published in 1977. And Susan Craig located this particular pamphlet and did an afterword, so it was reprinted. New Beacon Books, of course, was led by the OWTU's European representative, Trinidadian comrade, very important comrade, John LaRose. And so this is what he said. Politics. Important as have been the results on the trade union front, on the political front, nothing short of a revolution has occurred. And he goes on. I'm just going to give you some short quotes because time is against us. But I just want to establish some important points coming out of the experience of 1937. He continues. It is a far cry from the Dominica Conference of 1932. Now, there were several conferences of West Indian labor leaders. The first one was in British Guyana, organized by Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow, not Nathaniel Critchlow of NUGFW, Trinidad and Tobago, infamy, but Hubert Critchlow of British Guyana in 1926. The second one was in Dominica in 1932. So Lewis says this, and I'm quoting, "It is a far cry from the Dominica Conference of 1932 to the Trinidad Congress of 1938. As will be seen from the report quoted in the appendix to this, federation and full elective control figured prominently in the resolutions, but even more attention was devoted to the demands for adult suffrage, dismemberment of plantations, and creation of a cooperative peasant community, nationalization of the sugar factories and public utilities, provision of old age pensions, health and unemployment insurance, and reformed industrial legislation. This was essentially a labor congress. It is mainly on the development of this united labor movement that future progress in the West Indies depends." And the last point I'm going to make. So you notice what the reference there was nothing that he referred to in terms of 5%, 10%, back pay, grievance handling, promotion, etc. Right? All the things that comrades of mine in the union did while I was there for 39 years, and Comrade Gibson is continuing to do with Comrade Benny and the others continuing to do now, and so on. No reference to that at all, right? And comrades who have heard me speak in OWTU seminars, I make this point very strongly. And because we're in polite company and so on, Mrs. Ramchan is here and so on, I'm not going to say it the way I say it in Paramount Building in a seminar, right? But the point is the same. So Lewis then goes on to say, the labor movement is on the march. It has already behind it a history of great achievement in a short space of time. It will make of the West Indies of the future a country where the common man may lead a cultured life in freedom and prosperity. So what he was saying was that the labor movement had both an agenda, a vision, and in the appendix there's a summary of the resolutions and so on, federation, constitutional reform, purely elected legislatures, qualifications of elected members to be solely on an educational basis, executive council to be elected by members of the legislature and to be responsible to the legislature, legislative council to elect its own president, etc., etc., etc. Land and factories, nationalization of the sugar industry, and so on. Purchase by government of large sugar estates for redistribution among peasants on easy terms of sale. The prohibition of the ownership by a single individual, firm, or company, directly or indirectly, of a sugar estate of more than 50 acres. The ownership by the government alone of all sugar factories. We're talking about 1938, you know, 1938. Very, very detailed cooperative marketing, local prices, preferential treatment, and so on. Public utilities. This conference recommends that all essential utility services, namely railways, water, electricity, tramways, and telephones, should be owned by the state or municipality, etc., etc. And they go on to deal with minimum wage and other things. Deals with courts. This conference is of the opinion that the West Indian Court of Appeal should have its adjudication enlarged so as to permit of its hearings appeals in criminal cases. ICCJ, you know. 1938, the labor movement was advocating for the CCJ. Yes, all criminal matters, final court should be this, and so on. Anyways, so there was a vision, and the labor movement backed it up by mass action. And a number of those demands, of course, were eventually achieved. We got universal adult franchise, first elections in 46 and so on basis of universal adult franchise. Federation was attempted, but not on the basis of the labor movement's agenda of a strong central government, being able to pool all the resources and so on. So federation eventually collapsed, and so on and so on. We got access to education and housing and healthcare improved. So a lot of the social issues were addressed. But I want to now quote briefly from Susan Craig's Smiles and Blood, which talks about the 1937 revolt here in Trinidad and Tobago. And she also, as Professor Samaru addressed a moment ago, spoke to this problem that both the governor and the secretary, Nankivel, had in terms of their relationship or sympathy with the workers, but their loyalty to the king. So there was this particular memorandum of 1930 coming out of the colonial office, which in the UK, out of London, saying the following. So this is even before 1937. There is a danger that without sympathetic supervision and guidance, organizations of laborers without experience of combination for any social or economic purposes may fall under the domination of disaffected persons by whom their activities may be diverted to improper and mischievous ends. I accordingly feel that it is the duty of colonial governments to take such steps as may be possible to smooth the passage of such organizations into constitutional channels, end of quote. And then another quote that I want to pull from this pamphlet by Susan Craig. She said the following: in 1937, the workers won the right to organize trade unions, but this was accompanied by the determination of the ruling class so as to control those unions, that the gain to labor would be nullified. In other words, her analysis now, based upon that colonial memo that I just quoted, that the colonial authorities said, yes, unions will be formed, but you will get disaffected people like Butler, and that reference was made by Professor Samaru, disaffected people like Butler, who would stir up the masses and agitate them and so on, as per the speech of Lamech, which was really paraphrasing Butler's speech when he was before the court that Professor Ramchan gave us. And so the colonial authorities didn't want people like Butler at all to get anywhere near either control of unions, or if they did, certainly not to get into political power. So they said here, they continue. One of the functions of any, this is now a quote from one of the colonial officials, Ormsby Gore. One of the functions of any colonial labor organization, not meaning a trade union, but Department of Labor, like the Ministry of Labor, of any colonial labor organization should be to report to governments on the developments which may have taken place in the direction of the formation of trade unions, their general conduct and tendencies, and their relations with employers. And Susan Craig then goes on to say, the history of Caribbean trade unions remains a history of conflict and tension between these competing interests. Now, I want to stop there and then to shift to a lecture by George Lamech called The Sovereignty of the Imagination, and quote briefly from it, and he then quotes from some other people. So Lamech says, we hear Norman Manley say, so he's now quoting from Norman Manley, who was the leader of, one of the leaders of the movement of 1938 in Jamaica, and became, when they formed the People's National Party and so on. Manley says, the mass of the population are the real people. Those who would not unite with them in all fundamental matters are the real aliens in the land. And we believe that the people must believe in themselves and their own destiny, and must do so with pride and with confidence and with determination to win equality with the rest of mankind, and equality in terms of humanity, which, irrespective of power and wealth, can be measured by the growing values of civilization and culture. That is Norman Manley speaking about the mass of the people must believe in themselves and their own destiny, and do so with pride and with confidence. Rex Nettleford, well, let me say that Lamech then quotes Lawrence Nurse, Barbadian, who lectured, probably retired by now, at Cave Hill. And Lawrence Nurse wrote an essay called Organized Labor in the Caribbean Commonwealth. And this is what Nurse said. The 1930s represented an effective challenge which brought together sectional interests, proletariat, peasants, and members of an emergent middle class. The proletariat and the peasants entered the struggle in protest against the social economic deprivation. The middle class, though arguing for the franchise and right of political rights, was interested in political power for itself. Organized labor became the major force in the democratization of Caribbean societies. They challenged the insult of racial discrimination, which retarded the progress of the black middle class. They fought for the extension of the franchise until universal adult franchise was achieved. They secured the legal rights of the trade union in a series of constitutional reforms, which led ultimately to political independence. But all these forces served well the political interest of the middle class. Political leaders gave their approval to a particular type of union and institutionalized the Westminster two-party model of government in the region. End of Nurse's quote. And Lamech then said, and so what started as a radical response to the planter oligarchy of the day was gradually led into a series of compromises which now makes the victory of the 1930s seem less secure. Rex Nettleford, the Vice Chancellor of the university, who is a very prudent man, when reflecting on nation building, expresses this apprehension, and Lamech now quotes Nettleford. Nettleford says, I have a deep concern that trade unions are being pushed further and further on the periphery of all social and economic arrangements throughout the Caribbean region for the convenience of the historical plantocracy, the enduring commission agency class, or 1%, and the newly arrived technocracy. End of quote. That's Rex Nettleford. And my last quote now that Lamech makes is this. Okay, so let me just quote Lamech. Following up from that, Lamech says the following. The last 60 years since 1938, because he was writing this 20 years ago, but it's as true now as it was 20 years ago. The last 60 years since 1938 must be regarded, therefore, as a period of transition. We have seen the gradual erosion of an old social order. The political directorates have changed complexion, but they operate within the same basic institutions. There has been no great structural change in the patterns of ownership and control, and the new political directorates have never been a part of the old ruling planter and merchant class. They govern, but they do not rule. The transnational corporation assumed a novel dominance in all regional affairs. Domestic policy is determined by international lending agencies. Independence has not yet won the right to sovereignty. And I'm ending Lamech's quote. And then Lamech goes on to quote one other historian, since we're in the presence of historians and people from the university, I thought I would put some quotes back for them and so on. Not me, these are eminent people. Professor Elsie Govaya, in her book Slave Society in the British Leeward Islands, wrote the following: ever since the time of emancipation, we have been trying to combine opposite principles in our social system, but sooner or later we shall have to face the fact that we are courting defeat when we attempt to build a new heritage of freedom upon a structure of society which binds us all too closely to the old heritage of slavery. So, she goes on to say, the most profound incompatibility necessarily results from the uneasy union which joins democracy with the accumulated remains of enslavement. I want to suggest, comrades, and I'm just going to make one concluding remark now based upon all that I've quoted. I want to say two things. First of all, it's not strange that some people are going to Tobago on Tuesday and that the JTUM will be on Fyzabad on Tuesday. It's not strange that I heard advertised Chow and Choker sponsored by NUGFW at Cipriani Labour College for Tuesday, while we will be in Fyzabad. It's an old struggle. Comrade Miraj and Comrade Kuhlman will know the battles that we had in terms of Fyzabad. Because the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, after Butler was restored to the union in 1969, the OWTU under the leadership, rebel leadership of George Weeks, came down to Fyzabad every June 19th. Not a lot, a few, because it wasn't a working day, and joined Butler. And then, of course, the second state of emergency, 71 to 72, ended just immediately after the Industrial Relations Act was passed, when Comrade Weeks and other comrades were in political detention. And the IRA was passed, and then the emergency was lifted, and then June 19th became a public holiday, and May Day ceased to be a public holiday. And after that, there was always a battle as to where June 19th should be celebrated. And we had Congress going to Arima, going to in Port of Spain. One year they kind of tried coming south. They reached as far as Skinner Park. Comrade Miraj and Comrade Kuhlman, go remember that. They reached Skinner Park, but they couldn't pass. They couldn't pass the Cipero River and come further south and so on. So we know that June 19th is Fyzabad and Fyzabad is June 19th. But the reason why there is no trade union unity and can be no trade union unity is because those unions are the ones that were being channeled, according to Craig, into constitutional channels, and therefore were not interested in the tradition of and spirit of June 19th, 1937. And therefore, when the labor movement split in the 50s, when the international labor movement split in the 50s between the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, which was established by the British and the Americans as an imperialist response to the World Federation of Trade Unions, which was the United Trade Union body at the time. And the British and the American trade unions got West Indian trade unions to break up the Caribbean Labor Congress and then join CADERIT, the Caribbean division of ORIT, which is the Spanish acronym for the Regional Organization of International Workers. The Oilfield Workers Trade Union never joined CADERIT and remained firm that we were not going to be part of that imperial agenda. And so the divisions began around, because there was no PNM in 1953 and all of that. The division was political and ideological. It was very, very clear. And of course, post the advent of PNM and the PDP, which later became DLP and so on, the party politics then also impacted upon trade union unity. But the first driver was not party politics, it was politics, political position, ideological position, and so on. And the clear description of the imperial agenda for the trade union movement, which Susan Craig outlined in Smiles and Blood, which we never became a part of. So that is the fundamental, the most important and fundamental reason why there is no unity in the trade union movement. So that's my first point. And we have to be clear about that and so on, and not say it's about personality and whatever. Of course, there are foolish personalities like Duke and the others, but it's not about that. There are fundamental issues at the core of why there is trade union disunity. For example, why the industrial court in its judgment or the dismissal of, was it 11 or 11 workers, said that the dismissal went to the core of violating the core conventions. There are 4 ILO core conventions, and 2 were violated by that dismissal. The right to freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining, and of course, non-victimization for union activities. And imagine the industrial court speaking about a trade union violating core ILO conventions. But leave that part of it aside. It has to do with the nature of the trade unions and different types of trade unions. The second point I want to make is that the agenda of 1937-38 has not been completed. And what has happened, according to Lamech, in the 60 years, so we could add 80 years since 1938. In the 80 years since 1938, and we could go 81 years since 37, but we were talking about Jamaica was 38, so that was the last one of the major revolts and so on. So in the 80 years since the 1930s, what we have seen is really a period of transition. And we have seen the gradual erosion of the old social order. And the political directorates have changed complexion. So they moved from the British, and then we had local, and in the locals we have changed complexion within the locals. So we have PNM, UNC, and there's a different complexion between the two. One is African, one is Indian, and so on. But they operate within the same basic institutions. There's been no great structural change in the patterns of ownership and control, which is why there's more wealth and income inequality today than there was 25 or 30 years ago. Not going as far back as the 30s, but 25, 30 years ago, there's more income, there was less income and wealth disparity 25, 30 years ago than there is today. And the new political directorates have never been a part of the old ruling planter and merchant class. They govern, but they don't rule. So the party financiers rule. The politicians govern. And they govern in the interests of those who rule. And so on. Domestic policy is determined by international lending agencies. Look what Mia Motley has to do now in Barbados. And so on and so on. Independence has not yet won the right to sovereignty, because Mr. Trump would like us to go and invade Venezuela together with the United States. I heard Ralph Gonzalez say that last week Friday at a conference in Guyana that I attended. He said, yes, the Americans want to invade. And all of that vote in the OAS is to set up the conditions for invasion. So the imperial agenda is still very much alive. I don't have a problem with that, because that is what they're supposed to do as imperialists, if commoners understand what I mean. What I have a problem with is whether we have an agenda, right? Does the working class today have an agenda? Do they have a vision? Do they have an agenda? Do they Do they have the same spirit of Butler and the warrior workers of the 1930s? Or are comrades too comfortable and soft and old? I don't know if those things go together. Old and soft go together. I have to ask the comrades who have retired like myself and so on. You get older, you get softer, you're more, amenable to make compromises and so on. Or you're prepared to fight for completing the revolution of 1937. So I want to say, and as my last thing I'm going to say, is that we have to make up our mind. Do we want to continue with the same old, to try to build freedom and democracy, because democracy is in the interest of the majority and working people are the majority, to build freedom and democracy on the institutions of the old colonial state and the old relations of power and control that go back to slavery and indenture and so on. And if comrades want to do that, then come 2020, you go back and vote PNM and UNC. Straight up. Or PNM or UNC. Because they're the ones, according to Nurse said it very clearly, not David Abdullah saying it now. Nurse said it very clearly. He said all these forces, including all what the labor movement fought for, served well the political interests of the middle class. So, comrades have to decide whether they're going to pursue their own class interests and agenda or pursue an agenda masked by race and so on, which did not exist, as Professor Sambu correctly said, in 1937, masked by the divisions of race and religion, and we're hearing plenty race talk and religious talk now. Yes? All kind of nonsense being said by everybody. So you could get your head tied up with that and vote those party lines and serve the interests of every other class but yourself, and then complain when you get retrenched and you get your pay cut and you have no progressive labor legislation in spite of MOU and Faizabad Accord and Manifesto and everything else. And comrades, I wouldn't feel sorry. Because we have a choice now. We have an alternative. And that is what we have to build between now and 2020. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, David. So my question to you and to the trade union movement is, where is the new Butler? Where is the new Renzi? Where is the new George Weeks? And I've mentioned three trade union leaders who each had visions for the development of Trinbago. And that's what we're waiting for. And I don't think you can expect the masses of the people to be conscientized by instinct. A speech here, as good as it is not enough for the people out there. So what the JTOM should do now is go out on a public campaign of informing people, as you are being informed tonight. And I think that's the way in which the people are not so stupid in Trinidad and Tobago. They are ignorant, and that's because of us, because of those of us who know and are not giving them the knowledge and the information. So I think the task of the trade union movement is not just now go out and educate, inform people. Some of the simple things that are being said here tonight are not known by the vast majority of the people. And as I said, you can't expect them to know it by instinct. There has to be a deliberate policy of going into all the nooks and crannies. And I'm quite sure, as one who was in politics for a long time, that the people are not as stupid as we think they are. And they would definitely and positively react in an aggressive way to this kind of information. So I think that's the challenge we have for the trade union movement, and there can be no other movement in Trinbago or the Caribbean right now than the trade union movement to point the way forward. I have no doubt in my mind that that's the only way. Right, so we'll ask as I said, a lot of work on the development of the trade union movement, and particularly on Butler. So he would talk to us for a while, and then we'd open it up to a larger discussion.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, comrades. I'm taking your tone and pitch. As I sat there, I was trying to convince myself about coming up here and speak. After all, this is a trade union movement. This is the Butler Hall of Revolution. And I wonder if anyone in the world would know more about Uriah Buzz Butler than your good selves. And when I heard Professor Samaru talk about Governor Murchison and so on, Fletcher and so on, and the compromising position in which he was put by the other side of the British administration, either toned down in respect of not toned down, since you have so well complimented the labor movement and the necessities of labor, you should demit office under the impression that you are no longer fit, in terms of health, or I would not give you your pension. And the man is forced to make that kind of decision. You understand the relationship between labor and government and how governments can influence decision. I have listened to brother or comrade Abdullah talk about labor being placed in constitutional channels for its control. And apart from constitutional challenge, which is a strategy of government to manipulate and dictate how unions move, that's not new. The history of the Caribbean is predicated on labor leaders, intellectuals who have been harmonized into collaboration against the masses without them knowing it. The British deliberately gave power to people who had British education, and deliberately give power, when it was not to those who had British education, to labor leaders who followed British convention in labor in the 1950s. So there has always been that harmonization from the point of view of British and metropolitan interests against the working class. I had the good fortune of reading Eric Williams' diaries. Dr. Samaru is my mentor in that respect. Everyone talks about Eric Williams and they don't read his diaries. And they try to form a judgment of this politician who was very astute. And they never looked at his diaries because they were so simplistic, little pocket diaries and so on, never carrying an insignia saying the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and so on. And you're not going to see labor leaders. You're going to see one or two. Trust me. That was strange. And that is because Eric Williams had them right where he wanted them. This is not new. They knew that. He knew that. The masses did not know that. They may think about it, but they cannot contemplate it in real terms. But Eric Williams wrote down everything he did, except if he was meeting with a member of the opposite sex. And in those diaries, he wrote down when he met with these labor leaders, and one or two of them show up for years. Is it that there was one particular body of representation on behalf of labor that Eric Williams spoke to? Or is it that there was a particular conversation going on and they had the ear of the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister had the ear of those labor leaders? But you have to read these things and do the research. So tonight, as fate would have it, my PowerPoint is not opening up. And I perhaps like that after all that I heard, because I was going to talk about so many things that I heard. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about, but what I really want to discuss is Uriah Buzz Butler in a philosophical context. I have a sword in my hand and I'm going to use it now. You know that? Butler used to say that all the time. I have a sword in my hand and I'm going to use it now. I want to talk about Butler and his life briefly, his early life, his entry into politics. Firstly, a kind of labor-type politics with Cipriani, then his development as a labor leader, his contribution to labor and politics, his contribution to Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, okay? His contribution to the masses. But I want to talk about Butler in terms of the rise of a leader of tremendous significance and then the demise of that leader. And I want to ask you, what you think would have been the cause of that? How can it be that as a society, as an academic community, as activists in our own right, this happened? Because I want to quote for you what Butler said to a writer near to his death. He said, I wanted to be clear that I was never a parochial leader, nor a village chief, nor a fighter for the South, and not the North. I was a national servant indeed, a Caribbean fighter. I never divided labor into North and South, sugar and oil. But I thought of labor as meaning all who work. I don't want to be remembered as a parochial leader. I can go further and say, I don't want to remember as a Baptist leader. I don't want to be remembered as a rabble-rouser. I don't want to be remembered as an insignificant labor leader who came and went. I want to be remembered as a national leader who impacted upon the Caribbean, who impacted upon the future generations and their material well-being, their conditions of life, their vision for the future, their hope for change. But the fact that Butler is saying that is because Butler senses something is radically wrong with the society and how it thinks. And then I take this other part up because I was born in Siparia. I didn't know Butler, but my mother spoke of Butler all the time, and my father, but they talked about the riot in Faizabad. The sad part of it is that I went to school with classmates who were the grandchildren of Uriah Butler, went to school with them, sat in class, did examinations with them, was taught by their mother, who was Butler's daughter, and I never knew. How could this happen in a society that fancies itself as based on education, high literacy, high understanding of democracy, high functionality at the academic level, receiving functional education, constituting tremendously to the leading and premier institutions of education in this part of the world, having a country that was run first at the national level by an historian, having so many political parties with erudite gentlemen, having so much talent and skills, and you don't know your national leaders. If you ask about Butler, they don't know. Williams is here or there. I interact with students every day. Makandal Daga, known because he was politically related to just yesterday, he would be forgotten. George Weeks, never heard of him. MacLeod, a government minister. David Abdullah, a rabble-rouser. Intellectuals to be, or who are leaders of the future generation. Garnet Searles and his sister, Garnetta Searles, I think, the daughter of Butler's daughter, the daughter and son of Butler's daughter. And if there's anyone from Siparia, they would know Garnet Searles. they provide some ideas to how it happened. At the time when we were going to school, Butler was being treated with tremendous disrespect. Disrespect by being unknown. That's the first level of disrespect. Disrespect after a fashion. Labor leaders are not incorporated into government in Trinidad and Tobago. Name one labor leader in government except in recent times. There's no room for labor leaders in government. Yes, President, to recent. I don't want to call political names. I will get to that point. You should not have started that, David. Okay? They said that the reason why no one mentioned anything to them, and they mentioned nothing to anyone, is because Butler was treated with contempt. That there was a certain level of indecency with too much association, to have too much association with Butler, or associated with Butler. And in this respect, this reminds me of another Caribbean leader, Marcus Garvey. Coming from the late 19th century, being a potent force in world affairs, making fundamental changes that would be critical in our lived experiences afterwards. But were it not for the fact that there were some reggae songs and so on and some Jamaican music, he would have been added to the list of unsung heroes, unknown. When, in fact, Garvey was one of those who influenced Butler. Butler was a Garveyite. The cause that Garvey espoused was espoused by others. Garvey was about Pan-Africanism, Pan-Ethiopianism. He understood other fusions and other developments in the period. Pan-Islamism with Palestine and the Middle East fighting the Israeli intrusion, or the Israel to be intrusion in that part of the world. Garvey would have known these things, because when Garvey was sent out in World War I, Garvey served in Egypt and Palestine. So he would have understood the forces there with the Islamic people fighting to repel the inflow of Jews, which Donald Trump so ceremoniously acclaimed as faith and justice recently with the transfer of the Palestinian capital, or the Jewish capital, to Jerusalem. The problem with Donald Trump, if I may say so with some humility, I don't want to accept too much humility this time, is that problem Donald Trump did not do any history. He's a nitwit when it comes to history. Nothing about history. Because that's a more complex problem which should not be solved by the pen of the president making a unanimous decision against those of world leaders and so on. Butler understood these things. He understood negritude. He understood the Indian struggle for independence. And he understood it very early. He understood a lot of things very early. Butler did not become a revolutionary in Trinidad. Butler was a revolutionary fella in his youth. Before he came to Trinidad, he was part of a movement for representation in Grenada. And it would be important for us to do some research on Butler at that level, at a very young age, at 17 years. He went to war, and he served under Captain Cipriani in Israel, or Egypt, or Palestine, because Israel is Palestine, is Canaan, and so on. And the soldiers of the First World War were treated to much disrespect. They were not permitted to fight in Europe because that meant they were fighting against people of another race. So you can fight in zones prescribed according to color. The fighting forces of the British government forces were organized according to color. and their leaders, right, those of a particular rank, had to be of a particular race. Cipriani, who was a person who had physical handicaps, got the position because he belonged to that particular ilk. But being a Trinidadian, where people, coming from a society where people are increasingly commingling, even though that there are race divisions and so on, but the society senses a need for some sort of cultural diplomacy. He recognized that the workers were oppressed. The soldiers were oppressed. And therefore, while serving, Cipriani did some protestation and representation on behalf of the workers. That inspired Butler. They marched straightway from the war to Trinidad with Cipriani as their leader in mind. And when after the war, circumstances proved to be less than they expected, rewards that is, for their effort and their dutiful, connection to the British government and this war to end all wars. When they discovered that they were not going to be compensated adequately, that they were returning to no jobs, that the ranked officers, right, will be celebrated in a particular way, while those who were coming, and coming from lower down will be made to march from South Key in Port of Spain, from the docks to the governor's office, and told, thank you for your service, goodbye, nothing to come, and that they had no recompense for their valiant effort, they began to protest. And Cipriani emerged as the natural leader. I like C.L.R. James a lot, but when he wrote The Life and Times of Captain Cipriani, he was not yet a mature writer. And therefore, he didn't recognize certain shortcomings in Cipriani's orientation. Cipriani was known as the barefoot leader, but it was not long before Cipriani ended up in collaboration with the government and capitalist interests. And this is what is happening in 1937. Those of us who think that there is much difference, or there were much differences between 1937 and 1970, we are wrong. It was the same unemployment, the same metropolitan exploitation, the same squalor, the same lack of rights, the same undemocratic society, the same hopelessness. Different time, different decade, different year, same life. And Cipriani, having secured office, having formed the Working Men's Association, having come to the reckoning that that organization has some limitations in respect of political influence, and that working organizations do not have some power, he went and formed the Trinidad Labour Party. Butler walked into it with him. If you check the records, while Butler is with Cipriani, in the 1930s, their relationships start to sever from the time the Labour Party emerges. Because being a part of the Labour Party and also being part of the legislative framework in Trinidad and Tobago, Cipriani is not hearing the masses. Am I making sense? One of the problems in Trinidad, I am beginning to realize, is that politics and labor are run by three bad, big orientations. Start with B. Big boyism, bacchanalism, and Bajonism. I will start explaining Bajonism first. Bajonism is not a Bajan prime minister. It's the Bajan of the state machinery working against the laboring classes because they are frustrated and they are exhibiting anxiety. Somehow, Trinidad has a track record of lacking a certain measure of empathy with the working class. That is a legacy of slavery and indentureship. All the politicians identify with workers. until the time when they get into office. And suddenly the worker does not have any intelligence. You know what the masters used to say when the slaves rebel? They are incapable of ideological thought. So they're rebelling because they're hungry and they're stupid. So when laborers protest for their livelihood, they are protesting because they lack ideology. You will think you'll have ideology. In fact, I have found that the labor movement has more ideology than the politicians. They're ideological. They are part of a global movement that understands that the worker is oppressed and the worker has to challenge that. The politicians are pragmatists. If the imperial powers and authorities say, shut down the strike, put some legislation against it, from Gary to Williams, who I have great respect for. I actually like the man. They follow. They trump and follow suit. So that's the Bajonism of the state. So that is why, my friend, my comrade, you were beaten when you went to protest. And you could get licks again, eh? Licks comes easy with the state machinery of Bajonism in former colonial regimes. Because the replacement regimes merely remove the colonial bosses and situate themselves in the leadership. Despite how grandiose their vision is, that's the thinking of training from the Westminster model and the Whitehall model of governance. They govern. Somebody else rule. And when they rule, that is what they do, they rule as the others before them. It is part of the orientation. And that orientation has never seen labor as intellectual. It has never seen labor as leadership. It has seen labors as articles of exploitation, as articles for use. That's the history of this region, which is rooted in slavery, indentureship, etc. That's how I see it. And I think Butler understood this. I think he understood it quite a lot. Butler, more than any labor leader, was committed to workers. Not Indian or African, but workers. He had worked, he had served, and he had seen the struggle at that level, and he felt it. When people talk about ministers, and they talk about Butler as the chief minister, it reminds us that Butler saw ministers in, its Latin reference, which means service, and its spiritual reference, which means serving with this kind of heart and spirit. That's not how politicians saw ministries and governance. It's a kind of, look where I reach. For want of a better term, I'm yet to describe it, but it becomes what you call big boyism. Suddenly the working class, their views don't matter. You have discussions about tripartite talks, but nobody is listening to the laboring classes. Somehow or the other, they have this history of making noise, and that's what they're going to do. You know what it is called? Labor rhetoric. So that's the big boys. The other part is bubbleism. Metropolitan powers, capital interests control the world. There's going to be no fundamental change in division of wealth in Trinidad and Tobago unless we understand that who pays the piper calls the tune. I am not sure if I'm right. David, you would have to guide me on this. I believe that it is only recently we have begun to deal seriously with the question of the gains from oil on behalf of the population of Trinidad and Tobago. Am I right? If at all we are dealing with it. In other words, our years of the exploration of the oil industry has not brought us real and deep ownership and distribution of wealth. Yes, we have gotten more schools. Yes, we have more hospitals. Yes, we have some roads and so on. But to me, the state, in its neo-colonial framework, gave away substantial amounts of our wealth to capitalist interests. You know how the scholars describe that? They say in Trinidad, and I'm talking about Dimas and others, this is what happens. The oil field workers trade union and the workers in the labor industry bid for big money. You didn't know that, huh? And then, when they do that, they start a cycle of negotiation, which will be followed by others in the next sector who want money commensurate whether or not it is there. So now you know you have to take blame for the workers in Trinidad and Tobago bargaining for higher wages in regular cycles without due consideration, whether they are dukes, monarchs, or oil field people. No deep understanding of what really is happening. But you see, the foreign powers control the commanding heights of the economy. You all would know that the wealth that they filter to Trinidad and Tobago, whether it's Trinidad bauxite, whether it's Trinidad oil, whether it's Guyanese bauxite, Jamaican bauxite, whether it was bananas or what have you, or what have you, it is the same sugar plantation. Externally propelled, externally controlled, decision made primarily in the interests of the expatriates, who get richer, and we get richer through the crumbs, and the gap between the rich and the poor widens. Nothing has changed in 2018. Nothing. Butler understood this. And Butler was actually quite serious about fighting for workers. Let me quote something for you, which I think you should hear. It's a quote from Butler, see if I can find it, in which he talks about sacrifice. Butler's speech from the docks, 9th December 1937. We too must be prepared to hand gifts to our fellows by sacrifice. We have to make sacrifices to make gifts. We are not in a position to make gifts without making sacrifices. So I want you to remember the words of John Ruskin. Out of the hands of pain and suffering, more gifts have come to us than from any other source. When you remember others, you are bound to have a feeling to make sacrifices, as I feel where I am standing. This is when Butler is on the docks. This is when Butler is, in the hands of the law, and he's commenting, yes, I can die. I can suffer pain. I can suffer anything in this fight for justice, for the oppressed people of beautiful Trinidad. Make no mistake about it. This is a cause that demands real men as leaders. Yes, a time like this demands real men as followers as well. A time like this demands men, real men, men of opinion, men of will, men whom the lust of office cannot kill. Yes, men with the soul of the master, the mind of the master to make sacrifices that others might enjoy a better and brighter day. People miss in Butler the religious dimension of his character. I've heard them say that he was a Baptist. I think he was also someone with a lot of Moravian influence. Okay? And he was also someone who had a strong Anglican background. What Butler combined was interest in people and the charisma of a preacher and a labor leader. That is what makes him strong. When you listen to Butler speak, I don't know if you all have copies of his speeches. There's a certain amount of eloquence, yet there's a certain amount of passion. And by the way, let me say, the thing in Trinidad is very bad. I am absolutely and totally disappointed with the language that goes in our parliament. It's not sweet, it's not alive, it's a lot of ruction, and they are debating. I mean, perhaps we are not to speak about this because in the United States it's not better having Trump there, you know, and so on and so on. But one would believe that when students and children listen to the politics of the parliament, it is a question of erudition. I find erudition is lacking. It has been lacking for some years. Let me tell you something. Again, it's the unfolding Trump scenario. People in Trinidad do not study history. Go and read the speeches of Toussaint Louverture, a man unlettered, so they say. Go and read the speeches of Gandhi, whom Butler followed. See depth. Go and read the speeches or listen to the speeches of the older politicians, and you would realize that we are living in a past paradise. It's gone. We're totally not with it. The language of debate is pathetic. The level of research is quite short, quite low. And what passes for real discourse do not match the days when the new colonials, the young colonials, colonial minds took over from the old colonials, at least. They discussed Section 34 without even referring to a parliamentary document that speaks to the rules of parliament. I was shocked. How you could discuss rules without discussing what the rules are and procedures. And so the thing goes on. You do this, well, I do that. You do that, that was you. This is me. This is my time. This is your time. Trinidad and Tobago for you. Trinidad and Tobago politics in 2018. No wonder the students at we don't listen to that. They prefer Beanie Man and Bungie Garland and whatnot. It's pathetic. When you listen to Butler, you do not get the impression of an illiterate person. But the British government, in its exorbitant wisdom and understanding how politics work, Eric Williams, a man of Oxford, Gomes, not necessarily an Eric Williams, but trained in the pragmatics of the cultured politician as they see it, and others. Butler wins an election in 1950, and they decide to ensure that he does not take office. He's denied political office for the same reason that you mentioned. People like Butler from the grassroots do not have too much intelligence. They are moved by emotions. They are very charismatic. People can follow them. They're going to carry us a wrong path. But they were doing it on other West Indian islands. Once you align yourself with the British Labour Party. Leaders in the Caribbean talk about independence. The leaders in the Caribbean didn't really carry on any fight for independence. Britain was tired, old, battered, bruised, what have you. Wanted to reduce the size of the colonial empire, but wanted to handpick the leaders that will lead the region. They wanted a federation more than other regions. They understood the federal idea. It is one office with all the shops, a one-stop shop. And you rule everybody with a stroke of a pen. Because it's easier. Why have to contemplate all these divisions and all these areas and territories when you could do it by making an imperial decision, which West Indian people are certain to love because they are nations of followership. And let me warn you, today, after Trinidad's achievement of independence and our achievement of Republican status, Guyana's achievement of Republican status, After Haiti's achievement of Republican status in 1804, the vast majority of countries in the Caribbean remain nothing but constitutional monarchies. The rulership of those countries is still the British Crown. Constitutional monarchies. Through presidencies in Trinidad. Okay? So, Butler is the man who started it. I don't want to say he was the father of the nation. Because to be the father of the nation, it means you must have a temporary sojourn in office. I think the NJAC guys have a certain level of feelings for Butler, not undeserved. He was incarcerated in Nelson Island. If Trinidad is serious about tourism, places like Nelson Island will be on the map. They will see the stones that Butler marked on every day because he had nothing else to do. They were virtually trying to drive him mad. One man on an island with one guard. They became friends. And then NJAC gave trouble in 1970 and other leaders because of the same circumstances in 1937. They put them on Nelson Island too. So they share a fraternal historical experience, different time, but same home with Butler. And they see him as the father of the nation. Fine, nothing is wrong with that. But he is tremendously important for the development of the labor movement. If today, and I grew up in Tutor, we could talk about increasing salaries, we can talk about strikes, we can talk about industrial action, we can talk about the rights of women, we can talk about workers' compensation. If today we can talk about all of these things, we owe it to Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler. The labor movement has its work cut out for it accordingly. You should ensure that the name Tubal Uriah Butler is on the lips of every woman, child, father in Trinidad and Tobago. You shouldn't have one day of celebration for the labor movement in Trinidad and Tobago. West Indian societies are built on labor, and they are the result of the exploitation of labor. You have more cause for comment, clarification, and pointing the way forward than anyone else. Dr. Samaru was absolutely right. But people are not going to see that, because West Indian labor organizations in Trinidad, which was the center of oil and energy, are conditioned to think of labor movements as obscurantists. They're blocking the progress of the country. They don't know. All they want is more money. They're keeping back oil production. Abdullah and them making noise for nothing. They want legislation that we can't afford. So fire a few more. Let them go home, because Asela Metal say we can't pay. And in today's world, you walk out after exploiting workers and nobody says anything. You have a big job to do, but you have to sell yourself. I get more intellectual discussion from labor, not all, I'm not speaking about Juke, from labor movements that are talking ideologically. The working class, the struggle of the working class, the man in the street, the upliftment of the general conditions facing people in Trinidad and Tobago, the Caribbean, elsewhere, the right to live, the right to dignity, the right to decent wages, the right to enjoy properly the resources of the state, the right to be heard, the right to be part of decision making. I don't know, I may be wrong, but tell me what decision was made in Trinidad that was conditioned by the input of the labor movement in recent times. Was there any? So you see where they have the labor movement. If you want to join that and you want help from the history department, we could talk about labor all the time, because we are all laboring. Labor is the common function of all. Just some people are smarter and they benefit from the exploitation of that labor. Our job is to turn that around. And I'm going to end now. Professor Samaru, I see the eye. The Prime Minister has said that people should study history in Trinidad. I am showing you the lack of functionality in this country. I commend the man. I think that's a good move. So they got a book to be written on history. History is contention of views. So you need many books. So the process has just started. But let me tell you something. Did you know that history is not taught in schools? How did we get to that sorry pass? History is not taught in schools. What is taught? Social studies, sociology, all that should be taught. But people cannot place Butler into historical perspectives if they are not being taught history. This is a historyless society, and that is why Butler is unknown. I thank you. By the way, friends are mentioned. All the prime ministers, Keith Rowley is mentioned. Motion is mentioned.
Of the ruling powers in the society, and see how indirectly, since you accept that you're not going to defeat them by confrontation, you're trying to push in a little idea here, push in a little idea there, so the fellows who are ruling the country will pick up a few ideas and possibly improve. So Arthur Lewis was a Fabian socialist in the sense that he, like the Fabians, agreed that you can't get rid of the whole capitalist system in Britain. So let me try and write about trade unionism and hope a few of them will read it and be influenced. The government would not allow him to register as a lawyer. They said you were creating a lot of problems in England and joining the IRA and so on, so we're not going to register you to call to the bar in Trinidad. And Renzi wrote this Fabian socialist, and he said, look what they're doing to me, and you know me very well, and we were sitting down together and having meetings and so on, and here I come back, I am a trained British lawyer, and the fellows are totally refusing to accept me. And it was only by the intervention of Sir Arthur Creed Jones, then a member of parliament, who wrote the governor and said, what you are doing is illegal, because the man has been admitted in Middle Temple in England, and you are saying no. So it is because of that Fabian socialist influence. I'm just giving you an example of how Fabianism operates. So it doesn't operate directly by confrontation, but by conversation, by conversion of people of a certain point of view. You want to change that view, and that is what is called Fabian socialism. Right, anybody else want to ask? Yeah, please in the back there, please. Yeah. Let the doctor, yeah.
Then go ahead, or you want me to go?
Let him go ahead.
Yeah, you go ahead first.
We'll come after.
Pleasant good evening to the head table. Good evening, comrades all. My name is Theophilus Joseph. I am the Assistant Secretary of the Forest Reserve Branch, the branch where this 80-year-old movement started. We all would have identified the good things that Comrade Butler would have done. I just want to mention a few of the attributes. He would have fought for self-rule. Let us rule our own destiny. He would have fought the multinational, the English crown. He was imprisoned. He spoke about to every barrel of oil that we sent to England, why don't the authorities put aside a penny for the workers? And today we have pension, Petrotrin pension fund being one of the biggest in Trinidad and Tobago, some $9 billion in surpluses. We have better working conditions for the people, not only in oil, for the workers not only in oil, but across the nation. And then we have the leaders who were trained by the crown, came to govern, and they continued assisting the exploitation of the wealth of this country, from Williams to Rowley. They continue to bring on austerity on the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. making life harder. Then the question is, who is really the father of this nation? Is it the father that brings on austerity, or the father that fought cruelty and injustice so that the citizens could enjoy a better day under the sun? Thank you.
Okay, I will add something to that, but I just want to make a point. There is a view that Eric Williams was a Fabian socialist. You would have heard the late Morgan Jobe say that Eric Williams was Marxist. He thought that capitalism and slavery was a Marxist text. Eric Williams was no Marxist. Eric Williams was not given to too much ideology and dogma. And that was one of the things about Fabianism about which Professor Samaru is absolutely correct. It's about gradualism, and you don't hold to dogma, but a level of pragmatism. There's therefore another Lewis that you should consult. This one is called Gordon Lewis, right, who was written on the West Indies. And Gordon was a Fabian, and he and Eric shared that bond, and Eric might very well have been Fabian. Because you see with the Fabians, you don't have to do anything or do it with a rush or with a political philosophy. Gradualism and what works. And if at all he was socialist, and I'm inclined to believe that he did have some socialist moves, right? That Eric Williams was a Fabian socialist, not a socialist. You have to be careful when you're saying socialist and Fabian socialist. There are some socialists who are not going to call Fabian socialist at all. That's the British overtone. And Eric Williams was done that. Eric Williams is British, really. He kept everything that they had. If British constitution was good for Britain, it's good for us. But Britain had no constitution, so you even give them one and say it was good for us. Right? Concerning Butler, I wonder if it is known that Butler was arrested on 3 occasions. 1937, 1939, and in the 60s. And there might be a 4th. I think he was arrested for squatting. That's the level to which Butler was brought. Are you aware of that? Okay.
And let me just add one thing. When the Moyne Commission came in 1938 to see what was happening in Trinidad, Butler was in hiding. And Butler said he'll come out because he was so committed to going before the Moyne Commission that I will come out and talk about the problems of the workers. And the British government said, yeah, come and talk. And as soon as he came out, they arrested him and put him back in jail.
Chairman, I don't know if I got this wrong somewhere. Wasn't there a governor of Jamaica, Lord Olivier, who was a Fabian socialist, and who brought Fabian socialism to Jamaica? Yes. And Lord Olivier himself, I think, was on a commission to Trinidad.
To look at the sugar industry.
Yeah.
Yes, he was a Fabian socialist.
Yeah, well, I like Fabian socialists, you know. I think given you have this enemy who's going to shoot you down, you really have to infiltrate and educate and work your way through.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, somebody else.
Last idea. I mean, one is free to call Butler the father of the nation. People have different orientations, right? I really like the term chief servant. I think Butler as a leader really was serving people at a level that other leaders could not contemplate. They just did not have it in them. I think he was a very humble man, but a very charismatic man and powerful. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with calling him father. People call people father. Even if it's not your father, if you're doing anything for them to call you father, you're right, you're entitled to do that. And there are those who would go down with the dyad notion that Eric Williams is the father of the nation. It's semantic. It makes good argument. My personal view is that that's a lot, right? I think locating Butler, for me, in the labor movement is where he is. People could question labor. Some people in Trinidad felt that Eric Williams was a father who caused people to leave. There are some arguments that will tell you people left under Eric Williams because they didn't feel satisfied that he understood that they were citizens, either because they were mixed or they were white or they were of another ethnic group or community, and they left, and you had all this kind of... So, you know, these things are debatable. So you are not wrong if you contemplate him as the father. It makes interesting reading. That will help too.
I'm an English professor, right? And that thing is called a father of the nation. I don't believe in the father of the nation. No way can there be the father of the nation. All of us are leaders. All of us have contributions to make. And there can be many fathers of the nation.
And mothers too.
And mothers.
They should know. Because unless the public is apprised of who runs Trinidad and Tobago, that little cartel, that cartel of the comprador class, agents of foreign institutions, they will continue to run us into the ground. And I think it is that kind of information that the OWTU should now be making available to the public. The information is easily available, it is there, but it is for the public to demand that we whom you have supported for so many years, and we now owe you, the public, a debt for having educated us, for having given us employment, and you must now ask us to reciprocate that debt that we owe to the public. So thanks very much.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad that OWTU responded to our suggestion that we should do this thing on Butler as part of our public outreach program. And I just want to follow up what Professor Samaru is saying. We ain't bound to wait for you all to ask us. Our committee can come up with a range of projects that we would be willing to do in collaboration with the OWTU. And while the talk was going on, changing the topic now, I had a question which I would like to leave with you. Whenever there is a strike, I am on the side of the workers. But always, a thing in my head says, oh God, they're striking against the Carib factory. When Carib settle, the price of Carib going up. So you're really striking against me. How? What mechanisms can we put in place to ensure that when you tell an employer you are making a 25% profit, make less, take less, and yes, and give wages to the workers, and don't go and up the price after the strike so that you undo the whole work of this. How do we prevent that kind of thing from happening?
Okay, I think we can give the panel a really big round of applause. It was a powerful panel discussion this evening. A really wonderful way to spend an evening here at the Butler Hall of Revolution. And let me just say, when you see that there is an alliance between academia and the proletariats, that is revolution. Eh? So I hope you all know what you could start. I just want to recognize, because all of this is about hope. Hope is so important in this time. And it's always important to identify and recognize a hope moment. And that moment actually is here tonight, because in our midst is a young man. He'll probably be shocked that I'm going to call his name, Kyle Nelson. He's from Faisabad Anglican Secondary School, and he's been in this hall sitting since 3:30 and still here with us. Can he stand? Kyle? Kyle, don't be bashful. Stand. This is the hope we're talking about. Secondary school young man who sat in here from 3:30 till this hour hearing about Butler and labor. To close off tonight, I think there can be no better person to bring this wonderful evening to a close. And this is just the start. This is just the beginning of what will be a really ongoing campaign. Comrades who know our first vice president well and know his antecedents and his history will know that he is really, we couldn't get a better person to close off. He himself has some roots that he shared with Butler. Please join me to bring on to close this evening's activity of our first Vice President, Comrade Carlton Gibson.
Thank you much, Comrade Chair, Professors Ramcham, Professor Brinsley Samaru, Dr. Tousse, and I heard also Professor David Abdullah. In your own rights. It's really an honor. I sat here and I listened to hear the presentation on Butler. And you know, it is really an honor also for a fellow Grenadian also to close off, right? Because we share something in common, Butler and I, from the same small island, Grenada, which created all of the wealth for Trinidad and Tobago. But we do this because Grenada and the other small islands is about love and sharing. And it's not just Trinidad and Tobago, it's the Caribbean. All Butler's struggle really wasn't about Trinidad. It was struggling for the masses of the Caribbean and beyond. You know, I remember when I came in the movement many years ago, I fell under the stewardship of a Grenadian branch president, a fellow called Dashing Head Roberts. You could imagine his head was like a dashing. And he was unlettered, but he was a very knowledgeable, very forceful character in the oil fields. And Dashing Head used to say something. You know, he used to always say that chapter made before book. But in his Grenadian twang, you know, you see chapter make before book, you know. And people used to laugh at him. And tonight, listening, you know, all of those chapters tonight of Butler, Rienzi, Cipriani, in the north, the Christina King, all those chapters, when you put them together, we can make many books. And it is important that these chapters, these books be written so that generations to come will understand the struggle waged by these stalwarts, these forerunners. Because it is really on their shoulders that we are climbing today. These comrades made a contribution. They didn't benefit from it, but they had a vision. And today we are the benefactors of that struggle and those strugglers. And therefore, we are just passing through here. We must document it, and we must ensure that this generation and the one to come understand the contribution made by these great stalwarts of labor. On the question of squatting, you know, somebody mentioned Butler was a squatter. Butler was no squatter. Butler was clear that we are the king's subjects, and the lands belongs to the king, and therefore the land belongs to us. And therefore, Butler was very forceful in establishing many villages. And I live in one of those villages close to Butler, in Guapo, in Filtration. Brute Force Village, Strikers Village, New Lands, New Village, and many such communities. Butler, in fact, ensured that his soldiers had lands to live, to plant, so that when there was a strike, it had food. It had food. And I can tell you, comrades, that we Grenadians like land. So a Grenadian will be shown a plot of land, 10 acres, 15 acres, and they will clear it, and they will plant fruits. And today, most of the comrades in South Trinidad, we inherited properties from our forefathers. And therefore, Butler was not just about fighting for wages, he also empowered us by giving us lands that belongs to the king, right? So it is really an honor tonight. It's a start of many more things to come. And it's unfortunate we don't have the full hall, but I know a journey starts with the first step. And today is the first step in an association between the House of Biswas and the OWTU. And I'm sure that we are going to grow from strength to strength. And I want to thank the table and also all of the participants here tonight. And don't forget, there is no Butler without Faizabad. There is no Faizabad without Butler. And Faizabad in itself, somebody else tell me the history of Faizabad. The comrades who came from India and the name of Faizabad and so on. Faizabad, it's a very significant area. Faizabad stood the test of times from the 37s, even 1970, before 70. The young movement, right? Young fighters. give their lives. Some of them came from Faizabad. So Faizabad is a place rich with history, and we will always continue to keep the flame burning, keep the fire on, and ensure that the revolution continues. Thank you very much.